author, columnist, managing editor of LibertyNation.com, podcast host and conservative policy advocate.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
Joe Biden picks a strange advocate. Hunter Biden ditches out on his deposition, and a whole lot more on this edition of Liberty Nation Radio. Heard coast to coast on the Radio American Network. I'm your host, Mark Angelides. And remember, this show is proudly sponsored by LibertyNation.com, where you can access a range of biting and brilliant shows to whet your appetite for freedom and your fondness for the great American Constitution. President Joe Biden, feeling the strain of multiple polls and wars and economic downturn, has decided to reach out to the one person he believes can save him. Now, is that decision fateful or fortunate? We're very fortunate ourselves to have Liberty Nation's senior political analyst and longtime host of this here radio show, Mr. Tim Donner, to help fathom that out. Tim, tell me it ain't so.
Well, I think that's what Democrats are saying across the country, Mark, when the word got out that not only is Hillary Clinton serving as a surrogate for the Joe Biden campaign, but she's serving as a primary surrogate, and her role is expected to increase over the next year. You know, I got to be honest with you, when I first saw it, I was so gobsmacked that it actually allowed me to do something that rarely happens, leave me speechless. Look, I don't even know where to begin with this one. Do they really think that the face of Democratic futility, the face of defeat to Donald Trump, the face of the email scandal, the face of election denialism? Yes, she denied her defeat in the election the same way Trump is accused of doing it in 2020. I mean, she is just absolutely toxic. I don't have to tell you or anybody else that. And the only thing I can think, that there's two things that might make sense. Number one, this might be the only way for Joe Biden to get Bill Clinton involved, who is, after all, while he's aging and not what he used to be, he's still a two-term president that Democrats like and the general public generally feels pretty good about. The other explanation is how I ended my article. And I did it tongue-in-cheek, but then after I wrote it and it was published, I started to think maybe there's a little bit of truth to it. And that is that hiring the most disgraced loser Democrat in recent memory is Joe Biden's way of saying, look, I don't really want to win this election. I get plausible deniability. I can bring her in. I'm bringing the team in to lift me up, knowing that she's only going to drag me down. I mean, here's a question, Mark.
Yeah.
If one of your principal talking points is that Trump is an election denier, why would your chief surrogate be someone who herself has denied her defeat in 2016, although she did concede on election night?
You know, I want to pull back to your original idea that there are perhaps two reasons that he's got her on board. One was, the first one that you said was because it's a connection towards Bill Clinton, Bubba.
Access to Bill.
Who is still very, very popular. Still very, very popular. No doubt about it. And not disliked, which is, I think, the key thing. People don't hate Bill Clinton.
Correct.
Even people, MAGA Republicans don't hate Bill Clinton. He's like, well, he's a Democrat. No, Bill's all right. But here's the thing. The most notable part is he wants the attention, perhaps, of a former two-term president. I know another former two-term president who doesn't seem to be willing to jump on board the Biden train. I refer, of course, to
yes, that's true. George
Barack
W.
Obama.
Bush. George W. The other one. Look, I think you bring up a really good point, because Barack Obama is the natural person to go out on the stump and to make the case.
Just to interrupt for a second. Barack and Michelle.
Barack. Look,
Barack and Michelle, the both of them together.
Let's go through the hierarchy of a Democratic leadership Obama has to be right at the top
Yeah.
because he's still wildly popular and he's a two-term president. You'd have to put, in second place, you'd have to put Bill Clinton because of the fact he was a two-term president and he's still popular. In third place, you would put Michelle Obama because she never made a bad decision as a president, and she's wildly popular among Democrats.
Actually,
But if once you get
I have that
past
same
those
record.
three,
I've never made a bad decision as president of the United States either.
Exactly. Neither have I.
So you talk about the hierarchy there.
Yeah, so the hierarchy goes from Obama to Bill Clinton to Michelle Obama. And once you get past those three, you're now essentially dumpster diving among the rest of the Democrats. And Hillary's the best of the rest because the top three will not get out there in support of Joe Biden. Now, maybe they will later, but by then, won't it be too late? I mean, won't the issue of his age only have gotten worse and be insoluble, totally insoluble? He can't reverse the age issue. But look, the top Democrats are not stepping up in his support when he's under siege in the polls. What does that tell you, Mark?
You know what? This brings us kind of to your second reasoning and also the conclusion of your excellent article on the pages of libertynation.com. I recommend everybody goes and reads it under the Tim Donner byline. Is that maybe Joe Biden just doesn't want to be president of the United States again, but he sees no way out. And you've got to have some sympathy for that. But this is a trap of his own making, because if not Joe Biden, then who? I mean, if he stays in, he must be feeling the age and the wear and tear on his body, not just physically, but mentally as well. But then who's left? Kamala Harris? She's even more unpopular than Joe Biden.
That's a big problem. That's the chicken that has come home to roost because she was picked strictly to run, not to serve. They knew that having a woman of color on the ticket, even though she was so wildly unpopular herself, would be just the ticket for Joe Biden in 2020. But now they're stuck with her. They can't dump her because the progressives would go wild.
Oh, yeah.
I was going to use a word that was like bat S / T, but, I think it's pretty clear that the confidence in Joe Biden on the Democratic side is extremely low. And you make the point that this is a problem of his own making, because if he had decided correctly, in the view of like 90% of Americans, not to run for a second term previously, if he had announced earlier this year, for example, he's not going to run again, he could have done a victory lap, talked about how he stabilized the country. He got all this legislation done, and now he's going to pass it on to the next generation of Democratic leadership. He could have, it really could have served him well to announce he wasn't going to run for a second term, as he promised in 2020. Instead, he's now become the poster child for Democratic futility. He's going to get blamed if he loses to Donald Trump, and he will go down in history as the man who put Donald Trump back in the White House.
Indeed. Either Donald Trump or Kamala Harris. Nobody wants to be responsible. On the left, nobody wants to be responsible for those two choices.
Is that the understatement of the year?
We'll be back with Tim Donner after this short break, talking Joe Biden's electoral chances, Donald Trump's electoral chances, and what's happening in the primaries. Don't go anywhere.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
2023 is winding down and 2024 is about to begin, and with that comes the presidential election in November. What's happening with the numbers, who's winning, who's on top, who's on the bottom, and how's it all going to go? We're very lucky to be joined once again by Liberty Nation's senior political analyst and longtime host of this here radio show, Mr. Tim Donner. Welcome back, Tim.
Thank you, Mark. Good to be here.
So, Tim, I just have to ask, what's happening with the numbers? I know you and I, we religiously check Real Clear Politics for any of the latest polling.
We do. We do.
It's a coffee ritual. But what are you seeing now? What's happening with, let's start with the presidential numbers.
Well, I think the headline is that this is the third time Donald Trump has run for president, and he is in the best position he has ever been in to recapture the White House. Now, of course, there's a huge caveat that if he gets convicted of any of these 91 charges and or even gets imprisoned, of course, that all blows up. But as of now, with people knowing that he has been indicted on 91 counts, he is 2.5 points ahead in the Real Clear Politics average of polls. And I think more notable is the fact that of the last 12 polls, Trump has won 10, Biden has won 1 by 1 point, and there's been one tie. So you can see where the tide is headed. And I think the problem for Joe Biden is he can say, and his apologists can say, look, the polls a year out mean absolutely nothing. That's not true. In 2011, a full year before the Obama-Romney race, Obama was up by 3.5 points. Okay, in 2019, a year before the 2020 election, Biden was up by 8 or 9 points. So polls a year out do matter. And the biggest problem is that he can't really solve what's ailing him. He can't solve his age. He can't solve his cognitive condition. He can't solve Ukraine. He can't solve Israel. He can't solve 8% mortgage rates. He can't solve crime rampant in our great cities, and he cannot or will not solve an open border. With all of that going to get against him, it almost seems inconceivable that he could be reelected.
Although the polls, as you rightly point out, the polls suggest a trend that is moving towards Donald Trump at a rate that, as a confirmed poll watcher, this is quite the rate. I mean, you don't see 10 out of 12 polls
look at this.
Going to one candidate.
In 2016, of course, famously, Trump was ahead in almost 0 polls. I think he led by 1 or 2 points in 2 or 3 polls in the entire year before the election. In 2020, Trump never led. He had, again, 1 or 2 polls where he was winning by 1 or 2 points, but he essentially has never led in the polls in the first 2 times he ran for president. Now he's led in the last 10 polls, and he's ahead by 2.5 points. And I'm sure the left doesn't want to hear it, but my goodness, Donald Trump is better positioned to win the presidency than he was in 2016 or 2020.
You're absolutely right, Tim. And the more recent polling that's dug into the swing states, it's like out of 6 swing states, Donald Trump is leading significantly in 5.
It's true. He's the swing state polls are not any more favorable for Biden. In fact, they're less favorable. But I'm still focusing on the wrong thing here, Mark, because I'm focusing on the head-to-head Trump versus Biden. In fact, it's not a head-to-head race.
Sure.
It's going to be at least a 5-way and very possibly a 6-way race when you add in Cornel West and Jill Stein and, of course, Joe Manchin.
Joe Manchin, yeah.
Might run, probably will. And biggest of all, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who's polling near double digits. When you factor in either 3 or 4 of those into the mix and make it a 5 or 6-way race, Trump's lead jumps to 6 points.
6 points, yeah.
6 points in the actual race that's being run now, although Manchin is a prospective candidate, but he's going to an awful lot of trouble for a guy who will turn around in the end and say, maybe not.
Yeah, well, that's the thing. That he's on a fact-finding mission, to find his soul.
He's trying to recapture his soul.
Yeah.
So then he can capture the soul of America, which Joe Biden, you know, he can finish the job started by Joe Biden
Yeah.
of restoring the soul of the nation.
So that's the situation for them. Yeah, I believe what you're referring to with the 6-point leader, that's if the election were held today.
Yes.
And I don't see things getting better over a period of time. Ukraine is not anywhere near ending, despite this dreadful war of attrition that is going to leave the country without a generation of young men. But it's no nearer to ending because people are not looking for a peaceful solution, from what I can tell. That's not going to get any better. Israel, maybe that'll be finished if Israel ends up wiping out every last member of Hamas. But then again, who knows? It'll just be somebody else doing it next time.
You know what? I think it's ironic. I think it's really ironic that the one thing that Biden has done that appears to be clearly right and positive, which is to stand in support of Israel in a mostly unwavering way, is the same thing that may cost him the election because his left flank is not going to just give in and say, okay, we'll vote for him, even though he's siding with Israel against the Palestinians. I think you'll see how radical they are. They're not going to forgive him.
It's such an animating issue for many on the fringe left that
it is. And he has to have their votes. And look at the demographics of this. He's losing the young vote. He's down by like 25, 30% among young voters. Black voters are supporting Trump to the tune of over 20%. Latinos are about split even, which, of course, Biden would have to dominate that group and Black voters and young voters. And he's barely holding his own. He's going to have to go out and spend his time shoring up his support among his base. And when you have to do that and you cannot expand past that, that's when you're going to lose because you have to win swing states. When you have to lock down a state like, let's say, Colorado, or you have to lock down a state like Connecticut, and you have to spend your time on that, that's a sure sign you're going to lose. And I'll tell you this, I've followed politics through, I believe it is 16 presidential cycles. I've never seen a candidate come back from a 6-point deficit 1 year before the election. Never seen it. Now, that again doesn't mean it can't happen. But I mean, Donald Trump got elected. Nobody thought that was possible. But I've never seen a candidate overcome a 6-point deficit. And if it was someone like Barack Obama, you'd see a lot of upside in terms of his ability to campaign and present his yes, we can. Okay. But Biden has no capacity to do that. And pulling in Hillary Clinton as his chief surrogate just like throws gasoline on a raging fire.
If Hillary Clinton's the answer, what the hell was the question? Tim Donner, thank you ever so much for being here.
All right. Thank you, Mark. This was just too much fun.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
Hunter Biden causes uproar by not appearing for a closed-door deposition. Now, what does that mean for Hunter Biden? What does it mean for Congress? And what does it mean for Joe Biden's chances of escaping an impeachment inquiry? Well, we're very fortunate to have with us today Mr. Scott D. Cosenza, Liberty Nation's legal affairs editor and host of the Most Excellent Uprising podcast. Welcome aboard, Scott.
Hi, Mark. Pleasure to be here.
Now, Scott, we're recording this on the day, literally minutes after Hunter Biden turned up at the Capitol building, due at 9:30 on Wednesday. And instead of going into the building, he stood on the steps and said, "I'm here to give a public testimony," rather than the closed door testimony for which he was subpoenaed, and then got in a car and drove off, surrounded by Secret Service agents. Now, Scott, correct me if I'm wrong, because I'm not a lawyer, as everybody knows who listens to this show. I wasn't aware that you could pick and choose how you get subpoenaed.
There's a great scene in The Wire, the fantastic serial by David Simon, where a person says something legalistic, and this attorney says, "Well, you're not a lawyer." And he says, "Why would somebody pretend to be a lawyer who wasn't?" Like, it was the most vile. I was just stuck with me as a good anti-lawyer joke. So I appreciate that. Yes, Mark, in a normal course of events for legal proceedings, one doesn't get to choose these things, except to say that in civil litigation, there is, there are accommodations made. So if you say, "Oh, I can't get to, the place before noon," or Tuesday's better than Wednesday, these sorts of things are typical. But the idea that you would be able to dictate as the subject of a deposition, especially a kind of hostile one, if we can say that.
I would say it was hostile. I mean, Hunter Biden
Yeah.
was talking about how MAGA Republicans are shameless.
Yeah.
I would say that was pretty hostile.
The thing is about Hunter, he's totally a political actor in this sense, I think, right? He's trying to help out his father's
Yes.
political fortunes, but also in some way, you could say that he's trying to help himself out. What I mean by that is Hunter Biden is charged with crimes that amount to over 40 years worth of imprisonment if he were to be convicted of them. He's currently facing those federal charges. So anything he says has to be with a mind's eye, I think, towards protecting his own interests to not being put in a cage.
Of course. Yeah. I mean, that's got to be the thing at the forefront, or as Joe Biden likes to say, and nobody else in the entire world says until Joe Biden says it, top of mind.
Let me add this, Mark, and
Sure.
I love that you are rejecting the notion that this is a British phrase that has somehow been imported to America.
Absolutely not.
I want you to lead the charge on that, to continue to. So I appreciate that. But and now I've lost my train of thought entirely. So anyway, I was going to say this. Excuse me. I recovered it. It's hard to imagine, strictly speaking, from the criminal liability perspective, why any attorney would allow Hunter Biden to go and appear and give testimony.
Yes.
Because testimony generally, the line is, every American TV watcher probably knows it by heart, that you have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you. And this part isn't a part of the phrase, Mark, but it should be included, and it cannot be used to help you. What I mean by that is a self-serving statement that a person makes often cannot be introduced in court because that is inadmissible under the hearsay rules. But a statement that incriminates you is an exception to the hearsay rule. So that's why, that's sort of like peeling the onion a little bit, a layer deeper too, is that's the reason why it will be used against you.
We need to hunt down this lady called Miranda who wrote these rights. Now, let's talk specifically about what this means for Hunter Biden. Yes, we're all agreed that it's in his best interest not to testify. I get that. But people aren't afforded that option, are they? When they're subpoenaed, they're usually not afforded the option, hey, you know what? It's better if I don't testify. It's better for me if I don't testify. So is that okay?
I'll tell you what. This is a good road to go down, because what would happen without the political feature of this drama, okay? If it weren't about electoral politics and power politics, it was just about the criminal charges, what would happen is Hunter Biden would be called and he would assert his right to remain silent, his Fifth Amendment right to be silent, that anything he said tended to incriminate himself. And I imagine that is a feature that Republicans are desirous of having to play on their election ads, and that Democrats are not. And so there's sort of this other element that's painting, coloring all the proceedings. There's another thing too, Mark, that I just want to make sure that we talk about while we're talking about Hunter Biden, because, while I'm not generally sympathetic to Mr. Biden, the younger, he is being set upon by prosecutors in a way that I think is totally unacceptable, and a lesson for all of us, just as with Donald Trump's prosecution, in terms of, it was okay for prosecutors if Hunter Biden never served one single day in jail if he pled guilty to the charges that they were offering him. And then when things went off the rails with that plea agreement, now he's going to make them prove their charges in court, right? He's going to go to trial on these criminal charges. Well, now the prosecutors say he should be convicted of crimes where it's appropriate to put him in prison for 42 years. At least 42, I think was the latest one I saw of somebody who did the math on it. Now, in what society is it just for a person to either get no days in prison or 42 years in prison, depending upon whether they say, yes, I did it, or no, I didn't do it? I think that is...
Well, I think the real issue there, Scott, is not that these are the broad array of options open to litigants and defendants. It's rather that on one side, you had a Department of Justice that was actively trying to help and mitigate and limit any damage that the younger Biden was facing. And then once that was exposed, they had to say, well, we've got to try and treat you like we treat everybody else instead, which is the 42-year, up to 42-year limit. So I don't think it's a question of that. Yes, certainly Hunter Biden is the piggy in the middle, as we call it, or the tennis ball on the court being whacked backwards and forwards by the two sides. But to say that, this is the scope of the scope of the punishment available to a normal litigant isn't quite right, because a normal defendant, because a normal defendant wouldn't have the Justice Department and the White House going to bat for him to try and limit those down to 0 days in jail.
You could be confused for being a lawyer after that explanation. It was very good, and I appreciate it. But I'm going to turn it around on you and say this. The reason why you're wrong about that is the reason why he is just like any other defendant is because it depends on the political view of his crime. And so what I mean by that is if you are a junkie who held up a pharmacy and stole some opioids, you're treated one way perhaps. And if you're the wife of a senator who finagled a prescription feloniously and illegally to feed your own addiction as another, well, one of those persons might get stomped on by the justice system while the other one gets basically a pass. Those are the political choices that I think, they're the discretion, boy,
well, that's the thing, right? As you've told me time and time again on this here radio show, the decision to prosecute is always political, which brings me to a very, very important question. Hunter Biden has taken upon himself, presumably with under the advice of his lawyer, Abby Lowell, one of the Boston Lowells, perhaps, I don't know, to not attend the deposition for which he was subpoenaed. Now, does that mean...
Or the political staff, by the way. That's the thing. You don't know who's directing these.
Sure. That's I mean, I believe that Eric Swalwell was standing literally alongside Hunter Biden. I believe that's the case.
I don't think he's on the legal team.
Well, yeah. But, he's possibly the worst optics to have there if that were the case. Now, so what decision is now left to the chairs of the House Oversight and Judiciary Committee? Because
Mark,
they subpoenaed him. And so now they are left with a choice to hold him in contempt of Congress, right?
Yeah. So what they can do is they can say you're in contempt for, they would vote on it, right? That requires another vote. It's not like if you don't comply with the subpoena, some clerk hits a button and you're automatically in that state. They'd have to vote on it.
Sure.
And then the Department of Justice, then President Joseph R. Biden Jr.'s appointee, Merrick Garland, would have to direct his seconds and deputies at the Department of Justice to haul young Mr. Biden before the court and bring him to justice. And of course, I went through all that ridiculous discussion because it's ridiculous to suggest that would ever happen. I don't think that it will. You know what, Scott? I'm gonna disagree with you, not from the legal angle, but from the political angle. What wonderful optics it would be for President Joe Biden to say, look at this, they're dragging my son into here. They've sent people to arrest my son for what? And they've dragged him there, and he's just going to sit there and say, I have no comment. I have no comment. I have no comment. I reserve my right to plead the Fifth Amendment. But Joe Biden will have this field day, or at least not Joe Biden, but his surrogates will have the field day of saying, look, they've arrested the president's son. Isn't this terrible? They're not going after the president. They're going after the president's son. That's a political win. We'll see.
We'll see. Scott DeCosenza, thanks ever so much for joining us. We'll be right back with Scott DeCosenza after this short break. Don't go anywhere.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
And we're back with Scott Diekcenter, Liberty Nation's legal affairs editor and host of the most excellent Uprising podcast that you can find at all good podcast providers. Now, earlier in the show, we talked Hunter Biden skipping his subpoenaed deposition, compelled deposition. But now I want to talk about something that's happening towards the Supreme Court, and that is special prosecutor in the case against Donald Trump for trying to overturn the 2020 election is seeking aid and comfort from the Supreme Court because he won a case. Explain that one to me, Scott.
Yeah, so we have to get our playbooks out and identify specifically, this is the D.C. federal criminal trial for Donald Trump. In that case, Donald Trump says, I can't be charged with these crimes for two reasons. One is I was president of the United States when I took these actions, and therefore I'm immune from prosecution for acting against the interest of president of the United States because I was, or excuse me, the United States, because I was the president and acting as the chief executive officer. That's claim one. Claim two is a double jeopardy claim. And people are aware this is for being tried for the same, well, tried is actually an interesting word there, for being placed, for twice being placed in jeopardy for the same crime. That's what double jeopardy is. And Donald Trump says that the proceedings in the Congress, namely impeachment and then a removal trial.
The Senate trial,
right, constituted that jeopardy. And so therefore, he shouldn't have to bear the burden of being again placed in jeopardy for that crime. So Judge Chutkan is the trial judge, the D.C. Circuit, the D.C. District Court judge who was appointed by Barack Hussein Obama. And she ruled that those against Donald Trump on those two arguments. She said, you don't get, you're not going to get the charges tossed on those grounds. And she, put a significant memo out detailing those, why that is. Donald Trump appealed that to the the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals, which is the proper, every district judge basically sits underneath an appeals court judge. And so appeals from those courts flow like a funnel up into that. And then the next stop would be the Supreme Court. And what the Supreme Court did, which was ultra rare, is take that case before it got to the DC
let's just
Court.
be clarify.
Hold on a second. I'm going to get through it. It took their case before it got to the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals on a motion by the special prosecutor. The special prosecutor,
Jack Smith.
Trump loses his motions. He appeals to the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals. Jack Smith says to the Supreme Court, hey, we can't wait around for the appeals court to do their job. And also, no matter what they say, you're going to have to be the ultimate decider of this case. So you should reach down and accept this case for argument. And that's what they did.
Okay, so the Supreme Court will be the final arbiters of whether this particular motion to claim immunity by former President Donald Trump is valid or
not. Two
not.
separate ones, by the way, just for the record. So there are two buckets that he could get out of jail free on, basically. One is the double jeopardy bucket, and one is the acts as president bucket.
Yeah, that's pretty. It's pretty fascinating. So I don't think it's as cut and dried as people make out, because I'm seeing all this social media chatter, and of course that is the worst place to get your actual solid information. God bless Elon Musk, but just for his efforts in making it a place there. But you've got all this noise out there saying, hey, this can't be right, that President Trump can be pardoned for crimes because he is a president. That means that he could just kill everybody and make himself a dictator, which is a terrible analysis, but it's one that you would think that previously serious people are grabbing onto. Could you tell me why they're desperately wrong in this matter?
Murder is not a job duty or you know what, it's funny because
it's not the role of, I mean, I know what the answer is, Scott. I've pretty much got it, I think. That is that the job of the executive is to enforce the will of the executive under the auspices of being the executive. Now, if Donald Trump were trying to, I don't know, to buy some illegal DVDs, that's not part of his job. I think I have a way
I have a way of presenting it that I think it'd be helpful for the audience, Mark, which is that if you take it away from politics and we just make it a company, let's make it the Coca-Cola company, okay?
Yep.
And if the CEO of Coca-Cola can shut down a bottling plant, he can start a new bottling plant. Maybe they can start a new recipe to some new diet fad they want to, with some new sweetener. They can do those sorts of things. But they probably can't open up a chain of TV repair shops, because
Sure.
it doesn't kind of make any sense that that would be part of the business, especially if it was a very considerable investment. The executive is charged with doing the normal operating of the business, and things that are way outside that operation generally require some extra permissions, basically, not part of the normal thing. And so if Donald Trump walked out on South Capitol or the Pennsylvania Avenue and started shooting people, that's entirely different than making phone calls saying, we should do X, Y, or Z to advance my chances of being the next president.
Yeah, I think that's a great assessment, Scott. Thank you for clearing that up, from saving me from the clutches of internet idiocy. Now, this brings us onto another question. Of course, the Supreme Court will be determining whether Donald Trump's claims are constitutional within the law, and then they'll send that decision back down. Now, Senate Judiciary Chairman Dick Durbin, just the other day, after Jack Smith asked the Supreme Court to hear this, he said, I've got this quote here, "There are so many unanswered questions about the relationship of the justice," talking about Justice Clarence Thomas, and his family with the Trump administration, "that I think in the interests of justice, he should recuse himself." There you go. Yeah. So already,
by the way, probably all the justices that Trump appointed, I'm guessing from the chairman's perspective, might want to recuse themselves too. So Gorsuch and Barrett. Then you just get Sotomayor. Matter of fact, we should just have Sotomayor and Kagan and Ketanji Brown Jackson. So yeah, the three of them. I'm sure that's what Dick Durbin would like.
I'm sure that they'd allow Chief Justice John Roberts to sit in there as well, just because, right?
This is where the years or year plus of kind of nuclear level attacks on Justice Thomas's reputation, I think, may pay a dividend, or some other justice. I was talking to somebody the other day about this case, and the pressures come from all over. So meaning these justices have people screaming and shouting from bullhorns outside their houses. You have to remember, it's not just on Twitter where these arguments live.
Well, the guy turning up at Justice Kavanaugh's house, ready to do damage and harm as well.
Oh, well, he a murderer, except for lack of skill, to be sure. But even outside of that, Justice Barrett's children's school was picketed. Why? Why is that an appropriate place, to express your dissatisfaction with a justice?
But the Supreme Court will eventually come down this one way or the other. And I think we're going to see some major fireworks, regardless of what that decision is. Scott, final word.
Well, Trump hasn't responded yet to the Smith request for the Supreme Court hearing, so we'll have to read his brief. But I suspect the arguments won't change much. And I expect to be disappointed, as in always, with our Supreme Court, and I suggest everyone else expect that too. And
regardless of which side you want to win.
Will be met. Indeed.
Scott DeCosenza, thank you ever so much.
Cheers. Thanks, Mark.
And that's about all we have time for on this week's edition of Liberty Nation Radio, heard coast to coast on the Radio America Network. I've been your host, Mark Angelides. My special thanks to Tim Donner and Scott DeCosenza for joining us today. And also my thanks to you, the listeners at home, for taking the time to tune in and week out. Thanks for being here. We'll see you next week.
We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
Don't get caught up in the media madness. Join our movement for free thinking and free speech at libertynation.com. Publishing news and analysis 24/7 with original articles by our team of authors who tell it like it is. Join us each week for online TV shows, The Uprising Podcast, and Liberty Nation Radio. We believe in free thinking and free speech. We are libertynation.com.